Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about governing policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. In this next segment, we're going to be hearing from some of the meteorologists and early warnings for flooding and extreme weather conditions in British Columbia. And the big question is, as a community, is your community prepared for extreme weather? Are you prepared for the flooding that could come? Do you have does your community have an evacuation plan? Do you have a go bag ready in case you are asked to evacuate? And these are some of the major questions that that you need to be asking yourself, your community, and your household. Are you prepared for the extreme weather to happen if it is going to happen in your area? The other thing is, do you how will you communicate to get news about what is going on, what is happening with the government and how they are handling things? These are some of the questions that of course are going to be asked and hopefully answered during this next press conference. So why don't we listen to the update from the weather experts in British Columbia. You're going to be hearing from Dave Campbell, head of the River Forecast Center in British Columbia, Emile Castellane, the Warning Preparedness Meteorologist, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Peter Brock, the Executive Director and Regional Operations Emergency Management BC. They have really important information that we all should probably really listen to, and go to their websites and download the information that they have, and make sure you have copies of it on hand, hard copies if at all possible. So let's listen to what they have to say.
And a follow-up. The first of our three presenters today is Armel Castellane, Warning Preparedness Meteorologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Armel, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And happy to be here. I'll just start off by saying that the following weather briefing will be provided in English, but questions are welcome in either official language, and response will be provided in the language of the question. L'exposé météorologique suivant sera fourni en anglais, mais vos questions sont bienvenues dans l'une ou l'autre des langues officielles, et les réponses seront fournies dans la langue de la question. So with that, I will share my screen and start up here. So I wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming in to this meeting from the Lekwungen speaking traditional territory known as the First Nations, the Songhees and Esquimalt, where I'm pleased to live and grow with my family. I'm just going to bring a briefing here regarding where we are in the grand scheme of things at the time of year that we're in. So May, June, and July are the wet part of the season for the interior of BC, right from the southern Rockies all the way up to Yukon. So with that, we are dealing with a fine balance of not getting too much rain or too much warmth in order to get a gradual melt of the snow. So we will be watching for those prolonged heat events going into the next few weeks, as well as the big heavy rain events that could be coming with lightning and heavy downpours. Here I'm showing you a map of BC outlined in black, and I'm talking about the precipitation over a 72-hour or a 3-day total. This is good for Thursday through till Saturday. We're looking at those values of purples, reaching up to 50, 60, maybe even 70 millimeters of rain on the coast. So a late push of subtropical origins for the north coast all the way down to the North Shore Mountains. That said, the areas of most concern are, of course, in the interior. So you can see the northeast in the Liard Basin, the Liard River is looking to see 20 millimeters widespread with potentially up to 40 millimeters in the thunderstorm and the convective activity. So this is an area where we're expecting continued rain right through until Saturday morning. Then, of course, right along the Rockies, another signal there, upwards of 20 millimeters, maybe even more in pockets of convection. And those are the areas that we're extra looking at for our partnership there with River Forecast Center. Looking at the week beyond next week, the 16th through to the 23rd, we're looking at probabilities here. You can see them in blue as being below seasonal values, in oranges and reds as being above seasonal values, as you can see a hint of that in Yukon. And then the purples are near seasonal values that you can see for the northwest of BC for the coming weeks. So this continues the trend that we have started in early April. Cooler and wetter conditions have prevailed very systematically. We've come closer to seasonal values of late, but we are looking to dip down back to the pattern of continued unstable and cooler weather. And here I'm showing you the forecast a little bit beyond that. So a monthly forecast from mid-June to mid-July. What we're describing here are, again, probabilities of continued cooler than seasonal values across the south of BC. We've got sea surface temperatures right offshore of Vancouver Island that are cooler than normal. They're an indirect result of the La Nina pattern that continues in the equatorial Pacific. However, when you look further north into BC and up into Yukon, Northwest Territories, we can see that warmer signal is starting to creep south. So we are going to see a trend shift by the middle of the month and last the better part of a month for the northern part of BC. Now, it's also important to think that there is uncertainty in this forecast, and it's also a glossy thing for an entire month. There's going to be events, a few days long, maybe even a week long, that move away from this narrative. So we will see potentially some warmth in the south and some cool in the north as well. And finally, just a word to stay tuned to the weather on a day-by-day basis, because at this time of year, it is very tricky to ask whether or not there's going to be a thunderstorm in 3 weeks' time. We cannot tell you that, but we can tell it to you in short fuse. And look at the website, weather.gc.ca, or download the app WeatherCan, and you can get the information brought to your fingertips in short order in order to understand when you're dealing with high convective or thunderstorm activity in your neck of the woods that could have an implication on the smaller tributaries and creeks, as well as, of course, the alert systems through River Forecast Center. So with that, I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Armel. Our next presentation will come from Dave Campbell, head of the River Forecast Center. Dave, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. So British Columbia is in the middle of the freshet season, and this is the time of year when the mountain snowpacks melt and fill the rivers of the province with that snow melt. It's also the period of time when, particularly in the BC interior, those rivers are at risk to flooding. Yesterday, the River Forecast Center released our June 1st snow bulletin, and this is based on a number of measurements that are taken in the snowpack across the province. And what we saw on that in those surveys was the ongoing trend of high snowpack across the province. We've got 165% of normal as a province average for snowpack for June 1st, with a number of areas with extremely high levels, particularly in a number of the mountainous regions of the interior. Now, as we come into June, that kind of high value, what that represents really this year is that delay in the snow melt that Armel talked about. We've seen extremely cool weather over the past 2 months, and that has really delayed that melt cycle through the province, probably on the order of 3 or 4 weeks later than normal. So in a typical year, we might have melted half of the snow. We're seeing that this year, only about 20% of the snow that we've accumulated has melted. We're seeing in some of the areas of the province, particularly in those low and mid elevation areas in the south interior and up into the Cariboo Plateau, for example, that a lot of that low mid elevation snow is more or less gone, and the flood risks related to snow melt in those areas has subsided. But yet in the higher snowpack areas, the high mountains in the interior, we're seeing that not only is it delayed, but there's still lots of snow still to come down, particularly over the next few weeks. And this includes areas around, for example, the Cariboo Mountains, areas draining into the Quesnel River, the North Thompson River and its tributaries, up into the Upper Fraser and the Robson Valley in particular have, in some cases, record snowpack. Based on the trends that we're seeing, we really have turned the corner. So over the last couple of weeks, we're seeing that snow is melting. It's starting to bring up the rivers around the province. Many of them are approaching near capacity for the amount of flow that they can handle and getting into that typical peak level that we're used to on a year-to-year basis. And this really brings us into what is going to be the kind of critical window for freshet season across the province over the next few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. We are expecting that with these rivers full, we are very much vulnerable to any kind of extreme weather pattern that might emerge. That could include hot weather scenarios, which are of specific concern, but can also be concerning is ongoing or persistent rainfall patterns. Now, based on information that Environment and Climate Change Canada has provided today, we're not seeing, at least in the short term, that risk of hot weather scenario in the short term, but certainly we are in that period of ongoing wet weather. And so we will be watching that closely, and certainly there are some vulnerabilities associated with that. In terms of immediate concerns, we do have a number of warnings and advisories in effect, including a flood warning for the Liard River. We do expect to see additional rises into this weekend as a result of rainfall and snowmelt. We have flood watches in effect for the Bulkley and Skeena rivers, and high stream flow advisories in other areas of the Northwest. And again, these rivers are working through their peak snowmelt, and there is some additional short-term concern around rainfall. We're starting to see increased rates of snowmelt through those Cariboo Mountains, and this has prompted flood watch for areas around the Quesnel River and a high stream flow advisory into the North Thompson River. We do expect into this weekend and the next week that those areas could see deterioration in flows. We're seeing the results of that cumulative inflow onto the main tributaries of the Fraser River, and that has brought us up now to a typical peak level on the Fraser, and we know that we still have a lot of snow to melt and water to come down. We have issued a high stream flow advisory for the Fraser River from Quesnel all the way down through the Fraser Canyon, Hope, and then out to the ocean. We expect these flows are going to remain elevated with that near full capacity over the coming weeks, and particularly over that time, we are going to be vulnerable to that weather piece. The River Forecast Center is continuing to monitor and assess weather, snow conditions, river conditions across the province, and we'll be, of course, updating our warnings and advisories as conditions require. Additional information from the River Forecast Center, including our snow analysis, modeling, and our warnings, is available at the website, and that's www.gov.bc.ca/river forecast. That concludes the River Forecast Center update, and I'll pass it along to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker today is Peter Brock. He's the Executive Director of Regional Operations for Emergency Management BC. Peter, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. As you've heard from my colleagues today, large parts of British Columbia may be facing challenging flood conditions in the coming days and weeks. So it's important to be prepared for heavy rains, which could worsen existing flooding or create new flooding. British Columbians should pay close attention to weather forecasts and their local authorities and focus on the weather alerts from your area from Environment Canada. listen to your First Nation or local government, especially if evacuation alerts or evacuation orders are issued. We've already seen some evacuations in communities near Terrace this past weekend, and those evacuated have been provided with emergency support services. For those at risk of flooding, I encourage you to plan now. Assemble a grab-and-go bag for your household with the essentials that you'll need if you're asked to evacuate. And this should include medications and copies of important documents like insurance. Reach out to your friends and family who will be able to support you if you are evacuated so that local accommodation is available for those that have no other option. In preparation for spring flooding, Emergency Management BC has been pre-positioning flood mitigation assets across the province. And this includes sandbags and sandbag machines, tiger dams, and gabions. And we have been working with affected communities and the BC Wildfire Service crews to limit flood damage and get people out of harm's way when necessary. But in most of the interior, of course, the greatest risk may still be ahead of us. So if you're in an area of elevated risk, you can help prevent flooding by making sure gutters and the storm drains on your street are clear of leaves and debris. Keep away from river edges and shorelines. During periods of high flow, riverbanks may be unstable and more prone to collapse. And drive carefully. Never attempt to drive through floodwater. The depth of water pooling on the roads is not always obvious and can be dangerous. For more information, we have Prepared BC website and our flood preparedness guide online. And that contains useful information to help British Columbians understand what to do if their home or community is at risk. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to the moderator now.
Thank you very much, Peter. That concludes the speaker's portion of this briefing. I would invite media who'd like to ask a question to please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. Our first question today comes from Zara Premji, CBC. Zara, please go ahead.
Hi there, thank you. Yeah, so I'm not sure who can answer this question best, but at this point, it almost feels reminiscent of what we were talking about in the last big atmospheric river. I know you just gave some advice on how to prepare, but is there one strong hit-home comment or message you want to get out to people who maybe that message didn't get through last time and we really want to make sure it does this time? Is there that one strong message that you have for people?
Yeah, it's Peter from Emergency Management BC. Biggest message I'd like to put out today is that importance on really reaching out to friends and family that might be able to support you if you do get evacuated. And just to explain that further, we recognize with COVID-19 restrictions lifting that we're going to be experiencing or expecting a lot more travel, a lot more commercial accommodations being filled, including public facilities and venues that would have been absent or more vacant last year or last season. So it is really important that we try our best to keep locations that are made available for those that don't have friends and family. So that's a key message that I'd like to provide today. Another key message is that we are in regular contact with communities that are being impacted. We're holding regular coordination calls with those communities that have been impacted. And so we continue to work with them and looking out for the best interests of communities throughout this flood season. Thank you.
Sarah, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, just for my French colleagues, wondering if we can get Armel or anyone else who speaks French to perhaps get that answer in French for them, please.
Oui et non, c'est un peu difficile pour moi de parler pour Emergency Management BC, mais en gros, l'idée en soi, c'est que il faut vraiment que les gens soient prêts, s'il y a une évacuation, de pouvoir contacter leurs proches pour trouver de l'aide si cette éventualité était réalisée. Donc, il y a des crues et des inondations possibles, et donc il faut être préparé à l'avance avec tout ce qu'on peut faire, c'est avoir nos provisions prêtes à partir à un moment donné en très court terme, et puis aussi avoir pris des contacts à travers la province, parce que, comme le disait Peter, on sait que maintenant, avec les restrictions qui sont baissées, avec la pandémie qui est de moins en moins effective, on a de plus en plus d'hôtels et d'endroits publics qui sont sur réservation, et donc on a peut-être besoin d'autres avenues si on a besoin d'être évacué et d'aller quelque part de différent.
For our next question, we go to Luke Attinger of CJDC in the Peace. Luke, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this first question likely goes to emergency management. Just curious as to what's been delivered to the Liard region specifically as they are under a flood. I know you mentioned some.
Yes, yeah, correct. They are certainly experiencing flooding there. And so we've had regular coordination calls with the Liard community, and any requests that they've had for flood mitigation assets, we are either have supported or currently processing. So we continue to support them, and we can follow up with specifics there in regards to the flood mitigation supports.
Luke, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just to follow up on how flood conditions could compare or be similar to conditions experienced in 2021 in the Liard region.
I can try to tackle that one. I mean, I think one of the more recent flood events we've had up in the Liard was in 2012, where we saw some flows higher than we've got now anyway. And there certainly was localized impacts at that in communities through the region. There's certainly not the same level of kind of infrastructure areas at risk in comparison to the kind of impacts we saw in the November atmospheric river flooding. But we certainly have areas that are exposed and at risk. So trying to support those regions that require that support.
For the next question, we go to Lisa Yuzda, City News 1130. Lisa, please go ahead.
I'm wondering if I can get a sort of more general response to that, or looking more at Metro Vancouver or Lower Mainland, about comparing what we're seeing now to what we saw last year, because that's going to be what's fresh in most people's minds.
Yeah, I can take that, River Forecast Center. Certainly when we look at the spring freshet season, it's a very different process that drives the flooding. We're much into the snowpack, and it's a much more seasonal melt of that deep snowpack that is built up over the winter. And so in some respects, we can watch that snow melt. We've got a better handle on how that is coming down. It also affects different rivers in different ways. So we're have more concern over larger river systems, and they take weeks to build to their seasonal peak. In comparison to the fall, where we saw a very short duration, intense rainstorm driving up both local streams as well as overwhelming the capacity of those river channels. So it's a bit of a different process that affects different areas. That's not to say that the flooding itself does not impact things. So we're certainly watching rivers. We have concern over the larger river systems that do build and do have this high flow period. So for Metro Vancouver area, we're certainly focused on the Fraser River as being the main one that experiences the high flows at this time of year. Many of the local rivers are more prone to flooding and high flows during the rainfall in the fall. So they are less at risk to this sort of spring season snowmelt. And so certainly the Metro Vancouver area, the key concern is the big rivers, both local big rivers, but also really that Fraser River system.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up?
I just want to make sure that I'm fair. So fair to say that this is what we're seeing this year is what people are used to in years past, that it's a similar kind of risk that they've seen. People have lived in their home for years. It's a similar thing that they've seen annually. Lots of people will, I think, have, for lack of a better term, post-traumatic stress about what happened last year, but that they can be a little bit at ease that this is a more standard type cycle that we're seeing.
In terms of the seasonality, this is certainly the season where we see the spring melt. In terms of the conditions, we certainly have elevated risk around the province this year. We're seeing the high snowpack. The snow levels that we've got right now are unusually high, probably something that we see once every decade or so. So last time we've had similar conditions was back in 2012. We're seeing that delayed melt, and we're seeing those areas of the province that do have extremely high snowpack. So I would say that the risk profile coming into this season is elevated around the province. And we know that we have that seasonality in the risk. And at this point, it really is going to be, how does that snow melt over the coming weeks? So there certainly is risk. There's nothing imminent that we're seeing in terms of things like the Fraser River, but we know that the next few weeks is going to be that critical window of time.
Our next question comes from Gordon Hoekstra, Vancouver Sun. Gordon, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I just was wondering if we have a number. You mentioned some people have already been evacuated in Terrace. I'm not sure if there's anyone around the other places in the province that's been evacuated. Do we know how many people have been evacuated at this point?
Yeah, Peter Brock from Emergency Management BC. In the Terrace area there, we had roughly 300 people that were reported as affected within the surrounding area and the area itself from the river increase there. So that's the latest we have on those numbers.
Gordon, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Maybe just to follow up a little bit on sort of what actually is the kind of risk here. I'm most interested sort of in the most populous area, from Fraser Valley and Metro Vancouver. I think they mentioned that obviously there's an elevated risk, but there's no imminent risk right now. I mean, I don't know how detailed your forecasting is in the sense. Do you expect that there will be flooding, in the sort of those most populated regions along the Fraser River?
At this time of year, it very much is in that preparation side of things. So we know that flooding can occur as we go through the season, and the risk this year with the snowpack that we have is elevated for areas like the Lower Fraser. We obviously also know that that is a more high risk situation in terms of impacts or potential impacts. And so at this stage, it's very much watching that week to week weather. We don't have a clear picture of if it's going to flood or not. We're not able to forecast to that level of clarity beyond just looking at that kind of risk factor. So we're into that day by day, week by week monitoring of the weather, and we're at that stage where we could be vulnerable to that type of event if we're to get some kind of extreme weather pattern. We're not seeing that in the weather forecast right now, so that's why we'll continue to be vigilant watching. And in terms of readiness, it's really in that preparation phase of being aware that risks exist and preparing for them.
Our next question comes from Darren Bain, Vista Radio, I believe from the Cariboo region. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Darren, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question. I'm just curious if you could maybe speak to the risk and situation in the Prince George area a little bit more.
So we've seen throughout the winter very high snowpack, a number of record snow measurements that are taken in the upstream areas from Prince George, particularly the Fraser side of Prince George. That snow has not fully started to melt yet, so we're really quite early days in terms of the melt cycle through Prince George. We're seeing the Nechako River side come up into higher flows, but yet to see the same patterns that we're seeing in some of the other key tributaries downstream in the Fraser, like the North Thompson and Cariboo Mountains, which also drain into the north into the Fraser. So we anticipate we're probably maybe another week before we get into that critical window that will come through Prince George, but we're still very much have that elevated snowpack concern through Prince George area, and are expecting to see high flows as we come into the next week or two here.
Aaron, do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Amanda Hosgood of the Tyee. Amanda, please go ahead.
Hi there. My question's for Peter. Earlier this week, a large chunk of the Highway 16 corridor experienced a telecommunications outage. And I'm just wondering what sorts of contingency plans exist in an emergency situation to communicate with residents if communications are down?
Yeah, thanks. So we certainly have a variety of communication that we often use with communities. Some of that support comes in the form of kind of amateur radio based communication. Obviously, when we lose that type of technology, we recognize that as communities we're quite reliant on that. I think that's a nice example of just how communications are one of the more essential pieces for working through emergency management. And sometimes looking at some of the more older solutions or some of the ways that we used to communicate, it's a tall order, but often is required for us to try to work through those types of events.
Amanda, do you have a follow-up?
I'm just wondering if you have any advice for residents who may find themselves in an emergency situation without a way to get updates.
Yeah, advice, if they, it's your question in regards to if they don't have communication or access to the internet for updates?
Amanda?
Oh.
Did you catch that?
Yeah, just want to make sure, is Peter's response correct?
Yeah, I'm wondering about, like earlier this week, we didn't have access to phone, text, internet, anything like that. So if you find yourself feeling isolated, how would you get updates?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, my recommendation would be really important for communities to look at some of the preparedness manuals that we have on the MBC website, and those are available in both print form and digital form. And so I think it's a good reminder for all of us that a lot of the preparedness guides and the recommended actions that we encourage communities to take during emergencies or disasters, it's a good reminder that we certainly do rely on sophisticated communication technology, where possible, where it's available in communities. And so some of the literature and the recommended guides that we do provide strongly recommend communities that are living in isolated locations, or any community in BC for that matter, any household, consider printing those guides off so that they have them either in their grab and go bags or just in their community centers. We know that communications are not always guaranteed, so it's important for us to have access to that information whenever we can. Thanks.
We have time for one more question today, and we'll go to Amelia Macour of CBC Radio-Canada. Amelia, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question. I'll have a question in French and then a follow-up in English. Pour Monsieur Castellan, je voulais vous demander, en fait, si vous pouvez nous expliquer, en fait, qu'est-ce qui fait en sorte que les risques d'inondation sont beaucoup plus élevés ce printemps en Colombie-Britannique et au Yukon, si on compare peut-être au printemps passé?
Alors, c'est une très bonne question, et encore une fois, je vais parler pour David Campbell parce que c'est vraiment son domaine. Mais il faut comprendre que les conditions météorologiques qui, en amont de ce qu'on a vécu pendant l'hiver, et puis ensuite pendant un printemps qui était en fait plus froid que les normes saisonnières, et aussi plus enneigé finalement. On a continué à accumuler de la neige à travers le mois d'avril, mai et même en partie en mois de juin. Donc, on se retrouve avec un potentiel de neige en hautes altitudes ou en moyenne altitude dans certaines régions, qui est maintenant a eu un délai avant de maturer et de devenir prête à fondre. Et donc, on est dans ces moments critiques maintenant. Et il y a des similarités avec des années précédentes, notamment 2011 et 2012. Et même l'année dernière, si on pense à l'extrême nord-ouest de la Colombie-Britannique, dans le bassin versant du Liard River, on a eu beaucoup de neige dans ces régions-là l'année dernière aussi. Donc, il y a des similarités, mais il y a aussi des endroits qui sont différents. Il y a la saturation du sol aussi qui joue en compte. Et après, c'est vraiment la météo. Donc, l'année dernière, aujourd'hui, on pouvait déjà voir le dôme de chaleur qui nous parvenait, et on avait déjà vécu un mars, avril, mai assez sec en fait pour la grande majorité de la province. Donc, on se retrouve maintenant avec l'inverse. On a eu beaucoup plus d'un délai sur le printemps, et on ne voit pas un gros réchauffement dans les semaines à venir, ou certainement dans les 2 semaines à venir, et ça va être plutôt jouant avec la pluie qui tombe sur cette neige pour la fondre d'une façon efficace et rapide. Et donc, c'est là d'où viennent toutes les alertes que donne le River Forecast Center.
Amelia, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. And I think that would be more for BC emergency. So you touched up on better communication. I was wondering, compared to the huge floods that we had in November 2021, like what lessons did we learn from that and that we're I don't know, like applying right now to prevent or try to help with the possible floods that we might get in the next few weeks?
Yeah, so I think the key focus that we have right now is really focused on preparedness, as my colleague in River Forecast Center had mentioned. Really a tremendous amount of focus on working with communities in advance to ensure that their emergency management plans will suffice, and that if not, how we can assist and support. One of the things that we've been working on for quite some time, just prior to this briefing, of course, is just the annual seasonal readiness sessions that we hold with communities, local government, First Nation, emergency program coordinators to prepare for upcoming seasons. We know that the communities that are experiencing flooding or may experience flooding have been impacted by floods before, and it's really important that we do apply lessons learned for moving forward on how to improve our approach together, both communities and local government, First Nations, and the province. So yeah, the real focus right now is putting a lot of emphasis on preparedness, moving around our provincial stockpile of sandbags and flood control assets to ensure that communities that are requesting them have access to them, and just continuing to support each other through these hazard seasons. Thanks.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.